Creaking floorboards carry my weight as I freeze in the doorway, watching my son tuck forged papers behind his back. Still, I hold my breath, letting that same slow creak whisper through the hall instead of letting anger rise. As the sound deepens, it feels like the whole house is listening with me. While it hangs in the air, I understand this wasn't confusion. This was intent. The same creak tells me he crossed this line long before I caught him. That's when I decide justice comes quietly, on the step where a father finally stops pretending he didn't see the truth. Before the story begins, tell me, where are you watching from? I hope your day's gentle and calm. Please like, subscribe, and let's start our story together. Frank Mercer had always believed that a quiet Sunday evening could reset a family's soul. He'd spent his morning preparing the house the way he used to when Tyler was a boy, polishing the old oak table, lighting the soft amber lamp over the dining room, setting out Maggie's favorite floral plates. There was comfort in the ritual, even if tonight came with a heaviness he couldn't quite name. Maggie moved slowly through the kitchen beside him, humming under her breath the way she always did when she was nervous. She wanted the night to go well. Frank could feel it in every careful gesture she made. When Tyler and Brianna finally arrived, the temperature of the house seemed to shift. Brianna walked in first, her perfume hitting the air before her voice did, sharp and sweet at the same time. She scanned the table like an inspector arriving at a crime scene. Tyler entered behind her with a stiffness that twisted something inside Frank. His son used to walk into this home like it was safe ground. Now he moved like he was bracing for impact. "Looks homey," Brianna murmured, eyeing the meal with a tight smile. Maggie welcomed them warmly, choosing not to acknowledge the edge in Brianna's voice. Frank watched his wife's hands tremble slightly as she placed the final bowl on the table. He hated that she felt obligated to make peace with someone who clearly wasn't interested in offering any. Dinner began with the usual small talk, but the tension was immediate. Maggie poured Brianna a glass of sparkling water, and Brianna frowned as if the bubbles offended her. She commented that the roast looked a little dry, then noted that the mashed potatoes were too lumpy, and asked whether Maggie still used that outdated mixer. Each remark was casual but carried the unmistakable sting of someone trying to draw blood. Tyler said nothing. Not one word to defend his mother, not even a warning glance at his wife. Frank watched him carefully. The silence wasn't neutral, it was submission, maybe fear. Tyler cut his food into neat pieces he didn't eat, staring at his plate as if hoping the meal would end itself. It was the way he used to look after a rough day at school, except back then he'd talk. Back then he'd trust. Maggie tried to soften the atmosphere with gentle questions, asking about their week, their work, whether they'd been sleeping well. But every time she opened her mouth, Brianna found a reason to twist her words into something offensive. Frank felt something gather in his chest, a slow burn, controlled but rising. It was when Maggie offered a simple suggestion, a harmless kindness, that the night snapped in half. Brianna pushed her plate away with a small grimace. Maggie, noticing, asked softly if her stomach was bothering her and offered to make ginger tea. Before she could finish the sentence, Brianna stiffened as though Maggie had struck her instead of spoken to her. "Please don't tell me how to take care of myself," Brianna snapped, eyes flashing. "You always act like you know better than everyone else." Maggie blinked, visibly stunned. "Oh, I didn't mean it like—" "Yes, you did," Brianna interrupted, leaning forward. "You always do this, always pretending to be sweet while judging everything I say or do." Frank opened his mouth to intervene, but Maggie tried to calm the tension herself, lifting her palms in a small, gentle gesture. "I promise I wasn't judging." Something in Brianna detonated. She jumped from her chair, leaned across the table, and struck Maggie across the face with an open-palmed slap so sharp the sound cracked through the room. Maggie gasped, her hand immediately flying to her cheek. The entire table went silent except for the faint, unsteady rattle of silverware settling after the sudden movement. Frank rose so quickly his chair nearly toppled, Every instinct in him, every lesson from the Marines, every memory of protecting the woman he loved surged to the surface. His voice was a steel cable pulled to its limit. "What did you just do?" For a moment, Brianna looked genuinely startled by her own action, but it vanished instantly, replaced with a theatrical tremble of her lip, her eyes filling with perfectly timed tears. She stumbled back toward Tyler. "Maggie provoked me, she whispered hoarsely. "She's been doing it all night." Frank stared at her in disbelief. "You attacked her for offering tea." That was when Tyler finally stood. But he didn't go to Maggie. He moved to Brianna, putting himself between his parents and the woman who just struck his mother. His voice shook, not with rage, but something far more disorienting. "Dad, stop. Brianna didn't mean it. Mom shouldn't have pushed her." Maggie lowered her hand from her cheek, her face pale with hurt. Frank felt something inside him fracture, not just anger, but a deeper, older pain he hadn't felt since losing comrades long ago. His son wasn't defending his wife. He was betraying his mother. Frank stood there, breathing hard, staring at the family he no longer recognized, knowing with chilling certainty that this moment was going to ripple far beyond a single dinner. And nothing, absolutely nothing, was going to be the same after tonight. For a long, silent moment after the slap, Frank stood frozen in the wreckage of what had once been an ordinary family dinner. The room felt tilted, thrown off balance, as if gravity itself had shifted. Maggie sat trembling in her chair, her palm pressed lightly to the reddening side of her face. Brianna hovered beside Tyler with wide eyes and trembling lips, as if she were the one who had been attacked. Then Tyler spoke, quietly at first, almost like he was afraid of his own voice. "Mom, you shouldn't have provoked her." Frank's head snapped toward him. The words didn't make sense, not even as sound. He stared at his son, waiting for a correction, for any sign Tyler realized what he just said. But Tyler didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He kept his shoulders squared protectively toward Brianna, the woman who just struck his mother, as if she were the fragile one. "Tyler," Frank said slowly, his voice scraping against disbelief, "you saw what happened. You were sitting right here." "I saw Mom pushing her," Tyler insisted. His eyes flicked toward Maggie with something like accusation, conflicted, uneasy, but unmistakable. "She's been making comments all night. It's not like Brianna hit her for no reason." Maggie's breath caught like someone had pulled the air out of her chest. "Honey, I wasn't pushing anyone. I was just trying to help." Brianna let out a trembling sob, too loud, too precise, too perfectly timed. She leaned into Tyler as if her knees were giving out. "This always happens. I always get painted as the bad one. Your mother never liked me," she cried, wiping her eyes with dramatic sweeps of her fingers. Frank had seen real fear, real pain, real victims. Whatever Brianna was doing right now wasn't that. He took a step forward, still trying to keep his voice steady. "Brianna, you hit Maggie. We all know that. No one is confused." Brianna buried her face in Tyler's chest. I reacted. I shouldn't have, but she kept pushing. She always pushes. She makes me feel crazy." Maggie lifted her hands, almost pleading. "Sweetheart, I would never try to make you feel that way. I didn't mean." "Stop apologizing," Frank whispered, more to her than anyone else. "You didn't do anything wrong." But Maggie, always gentle, always the peacekeeper, looked up at him with damp eyes. "Frank, please don't escalate things. Let's just calm down." Calm down. Frank felt the words scrape against something raw inside him. His wife was sitting with a fresh handprint on her cheek, and she was still trying to make peace, still trying to hold the family together with her bare hands. Tyler pulled Brianna closer. "We're leaving," he announced, as if he were taking the moral high ground. This atmosphere isn't healthy." Frank stared at him, unable to reconcile the boy he raised with the man standing in front of him. "You're walking out after she assaulted your mother." Tyler stiffened. "I said we're leaving." Brianna sniffed, adding a soft, wounded tremor to her voice. I don't feel safe here. That single sentence hit Frank like a blow to the chest. He opened his mouth to respond, but Maggie's fingers found his wrist, a silent plea to stop, to not let things spiral further. Please, Frank, let them go, she whispered. The front door slammed so hard the walls shook. The echo reverberated through the house long after their car backed out of the driveway, red taillights streaking through the window until they vanished down the quiet suburban street. Frank locked the door slowly, his hand trembling just enough for him to notice. When he turned back toward the dining room, the scene felt hollow. Two empty chairs, half-eaten dinner plates, Maggie standing alone with her head bowed as if she were the one who'd done something wrong. He moved to her carefully, afraid she might break if he touched her too suddenly. Come sit, he murmured, guiding her to a chair. He retrieved the small first aid kit he kept under the sink and set it on the table with a soft thump. Maggie winced the moment he dabbed her cheek with a cool C. Loth, the skin was already swelling, a bruise forming beneath the surface. His hands weren't usually unsteady. They'd built businesses, repaired engines, steadied rifles in worse circumstances than this. But tonight they shook. This shouldn't have happened, he said quietly, not trusting his voice to rise above that. Maggie closed her eyes. She's stressed. Maybe she's going through something. Frank stared at the bruise darkening beneath his fingertips. Something inside him, something old and iron-bound, snapped tight. No, he whispered, more to himself than to her. This wasn't stress. This was a line crossed. He paused, his jaw tightening, his voice dropping into something cold and certain. They crossed a line, Maggie. And for the first time that night, Maggie didn't try to argue. She only looked at him, scared, unsure. While outside, the quiet hum of a car engine faded into the distance, carrying their son away from them in a direction Frank feared he might not return from. The next morning, the house felt heavier than it had the night before, as if the walls themselves were absorbing the fallout. Frank woke early, still replaying every second of the dinner. The slap, Tyler's expression, the way the front door shook in its frame as they stormed out. Maggie was already up, sitting quietly at the kitchen table with a mug of untouched tea. She lifted her hand self-consciously when he walked in, fingers grazing the side of her face as if to check whether the bruise had faded overnight. It hadn't. If anything, it had darkened. Before he could say anything, a knock came at the back door. It was firm, familiar Carl Jennings' knock. Frank opened the door to find Carl standing with his hands shoved into the pockets of his jacket, his face pulled tight with concern. I didn't want to pry, Carl began, but I heard pretty much everything last night. Frank felt his stomach twist. Everything. Carl nodded slowly. Voices carry on the street, and Brianna, she wasn't exactly quiet. Behind Frank, Maggie lowered her eyes. She never liked people knowing about conflict in their home. Her instinct was always to protect, even when she was the one hurt the most. Carl stepped inside, lowering his voice. I heard her yelling at Maggie, heard the slap too. It made my blood run cold. Maggie jumped in immediately, shaking her head. Carl, please don't make more of it. She just lost her temper. Carl turned gently toward her. Maggie, she hit you. That's not losing your temper, that's violence. Frank waited for Maggie to acknowledge it, but instead she looked down at her hands, twisting the edge of her sweater. Brianna's been under a lot of stress. Their mortgage, her work hours. Maybe it all just piled up. Frank couldn't stomach it anymore. Stop defending her. His voice came out sharper than he intended. Maggie flinched and he softened it. I mean it, Mag, she hit you. You don't get to apologize for that. Carl nodded firmly. Frank's right, something's wrong with that girl, and your son taking her side, that's not normal. Frank didn't respond. He didn't have the words yet, not for that, not for the part that hurt the most. When Carl left, Maggie tried to hide the bruise with makeup. She dabbed carefully at the purple mark, blending it into her skin until it faded into a muted shadow. Frank watched her from the doorway. "You don't have to hide it," he said quietly. Maggie met his eyes in the mirror. "I don't want Tyler thinking we're dramatizing things." "Dramatizing?" Frank stepped closer. "He watched his wife hit you." Maggie paused, her hand hovering in the air. "He was overwhelmed. You know how he gets when he feels torn." Frank wanted to argue, wanted to ask how long she planned to soften the edges of everyone else's cruelty. But before he could speak, his phone buzzed on the counter. A text from Tyler. He opened it, heart pounding in spite of himself. "Tyler, Mom crossed a line last night. Brianna is shaken. You both owe her an apology." Frank read it twice, unable to believe it. A coldness spread through him, not anger yet, but something deeper, a grief he didn't know how to name. He handed the phone silently to Maggie. Her face went pale, the warmth draining from her expression. He really thinks that," she whispered. Frank took the phone back, jaw tightening. He's not thinking for himself anymore. Tyler had changed, yes, but the change wasn't natural. It was shaped, molded, twisted. Frank felt it now with unsettling certainty. Brianna's influence was deeper than they understood. She had carved herself into Tyler's decisions, his reactions, even his loyalties. And that terrified him more than he wanted to admit. Later that afternoon, while Maggie moved slowly through chores to keep her mind busy, Frank went into his small home office. He pulled out a notebook from the drawer, one he usually used for grocery lists and project ideas, and began writing. The date, the time, the details of the dinner, the slap, Tyler's reaction, Brianna's words. He wrote it all down, his handwriting tight and controlled, even though he didn't yet understand why he felt compelled to document it. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was something older in him, the part trained to record events before the truth could be rewritten. As the sun dipped behind the neighbor's house, Frank checked on Maggie again. She was sitting in her recliner, blanket around her shoulders, staring at nothing. He sat beside her, letting the silence settle between them. But that silence shattered quickly. Around 10, long after most cars on their street had quieted, Frank heard the faint rumble of an engine outside. Not passing, not slowing. Sitting. Idling. He moved to the living room window, pulling the curtain back just an inch. Across the street, barely visible under the street lamp, sat a dark SUV. A shape in the driver's seat. He didn't need more than a second to recognize it. Brianna's car. Frank's pulse tightened. Whatever last night had started, it wasn't over. Not even close. Frank barely slept. The engine that had idled outside their house the night before lingered in his mind like a warning he couldn't shake. When he finally drifted off, it was closer to dawn than midnight, and even then the rest was thin, restless, and filled with indistinct shapes of headlights moving through fog. By the time he stepped into the kitchen, Maggie was already awake, sitting with her hands wrapped around a warm mug of tea. She wore a light layer of makeup over the bruise, but the swelling still pushed gently against the powder. She gave a small, tired smile when she saw him. It didn't reach her eyes. Frank kissed the top of her head and was about to speak when the doorbell rang, sharp, abrupt, and too purposeful to be accidental. Frank felt something in his chest lock into place. Maggie looked up at him, startled. When he opened the front door, Tyler and Brianna were standing on the porch. Not nervous. Not apologetic. Rigid, ready, like they had rehearsed this visit on the drive over. Brianna crossed her arms, chin lifted in a posture that tried to project confidence but instead came off defensive and cold. Tyler stood beside her but slightly behind, his expression tight, his jaw twitching. He didn't look angry, just cornered, brittle, and strangely determined. "We need to talk," Tyler said, voice clipped. Frank didn't open the door any wider. "About what?" Brianna pushed forward a step, ignoring the question entirely. "We're here because Maggie owes me an apology." From the living room, Maggie froze mid-sip of her tea. Frank felt his jaw tighten, the words punching the air between them. "She hit me first emotionally," Brianna continued. "She's been undermining me for months, making little comments, making me feel unwelcome. Last night was the breaking point." Frank stared at her, unable to believe the audacity. "You slapped my wife," he said evenly, fighting to keep his tone level. "She provoked me," Brianna snapped, "and she knows she did." Frank stepped forward, blocking their view of Maggie. "She won't apologize to her attacker." The porch went still. Tyler dragged in a breath, his eyes narrowing, his voice cracking like he was trying to hold something inside. "Dad, you're not being reasonable." "No," Frank replied, "I'm being factual." Brianna's composure shattered. She shoved past Tyler, pointing a trembling finger toward Frank's chest. "Your wife is manipulative," she shouted. "Everyone sees it except you. She plays innocent, but she makes me feel small every time we're here." "She asked if you needed tea," Frank said, his voice razor-thin. "That's not all she does." Brianna's voice pitched upward. "She gives these looks, those judgmental looks, like I'm some sort of mistake that Tyler brought home." Tyler stepped in quickly, putting a hand on Brianna's arm. "Bri, calm down." "No," she snapped at him before turning back to Frank. "We deserve an apology, especially Tyler. Your wife ruined our evening and then you challenged him like he's the villain." Frank opened his mouth to respond, but footfalls behind him made him glance back. Maggie stood in the hallway. She wasn't defensive, she wasn't angry, she looked heartbroken. "Brianna," she said softly, "I'm sorry you felt hurt, but I can't apologize for something I didn't do." Brianna scoffed, "Exactly what I expected." Tyler's voice changed then, cold, stripped of warmth. "If you can't apologize, then we need boundaries." Frank's brows drew together. "What kind of boundaries?" Tyler's jaw set. "Distance. Space. If you can't respect Brianna or take responsibility for hurting her, then we need to step back from this family. Maybe for a long time." Frank stared at him, searching his face for the boy he had raised, looking for hesitation, doubt, anything. But Tyler looked resolved, as if someone else's voice was steering his own. "You're saying," Frank said slowly, "that you'll cut us out if your mother doesn't apologize for being assaulted." Tyler's nostrils flared. "We're saying we can't be around toxic behavior. This is our boundary." Frank didn't look away. "If that's the price for protecting her," he said quietly, "so be it." The words landed heavy like a gavel. Tyler recoiled as if struck. Brianna tugged his arm hard. "Let's go," she snapped. Tyler didn't argue. They turned together, walking down the porch steps with stiff, angry movements. At the bottom of the walkway, Tyler glanced back once, just once, and Frank saw something flicker in his eyes. Hurt, confusion, shame. It passed too quickly to name. Then the car door slammed. The engine started. And they were gone. Inside, Maggie crumpled the moment the door closed. Tears spilled before she could even try to hide them. Frank caught her, holding her tightly as she buried her face in his chest, her shoulders shaking. "I didn't want this," she sobbed. "I didn't want to lose our son." Frank held her with both arms, feeling her grief vibrate through him. But beneath his own sorrow, beneath the ache of watching his wife break, something else rose. Something colder. Something heavier. Something he hadn't felt in decades. As he looked toward the empty porch, Frank understood it with chilling clarity. A darker resolve was forming. 3 days passed without a word from Tyler, each one heavier than the last. Frank spent them watching Maggie move through the house like she was walking underwater, slow, distracted, carrying a grief she didn't know how to set down. The bruise on her cheek had turned from purple to a sickly green, fading but stubborn. Frank caught her trying to hide it again that morning, brushing her hair forward in a way that wasn't natural for her. He wanted to tell her to stop, that she didn't need to hide anything in her own home. But before he could speak, a firm knock sounded at the door. Not a neighbor's knock, not a family knock. A professional knock. Frank opened it to find Detective Erica Vance standing on the porch, badge at her belt, expression steady but unreadable. She was the kind of woman who didn't waste time on pleasantries, and her presence alone pulled the air tight. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "I need to talk to you." Frank's stomach dropped. "Is this about what happened with my daughter-in-law?" Vance stepped inside when he moved aside. "It is," she replied, "and there's something you need to know." Maggie emerged from the kitchen, nervousness written plainly across her face. Vance offered her a small, respectful nod before turning back to Frank, her tone shifting into something sharper. "Brianna Mercer filed a police complaint this morning," she said. "She's accusing you of assault." For a moment Frank didn't react. The words didn't register. Assault. Him. It was so backward, so far from reality that his mind rejected it outright. But then the shock settled in cold, crawling slowly through his chest. "She's accusing me," he repeated, "of assaulting her." Vance nodded once. "She claims you lunged at her during the argument and grabbed her arm aggressively. She says she acted in self-defense." Maggie's hand flew to her chest. "That's not true. Frank never touched her. He wouldn't, he didn't." "I know," Vance said calmly, raising a hand. "Her statement has holes, but a complaint on record means I have to ask questions, and you need to understand why she filed it." Frank felt heat building in his face, anger, disbelief, the sour taste of betrayal twisting into something heavier. "She hits my wife," he said slowly, "and then files a complaint against me. That's exactly why I'm here." Vance's voice softened, not warm but cautious. "Mr. Mercer, they want something from you." The sentence hit like a slow hammer. Frank looked at her sharply. "What does that mean?" Vance shifted her weight slightly, as if choosing her words with precision. "This didn't start as a family argument that got out of control. There's more happening here. I can't disclose everything yet, but I've been looking into a few things involving your son and daughter-in-law." She paused, then delivered it cleanly. "Tyler is drowning in debt, bad debt, multiple accounts, several missed payments, and the pattern suggests someone pushed him into decisions he wasn't ready for." Frank stared at her. "What kind of decisions?" "Risky business ventures, quick profit investments, things he wasn't prepared for. And based on what I've seen, Brianna was a major influence in encouraging those risks." Maggie sank slowly into a chair, her face pale. "Tyler never said anything. Why wouldn't he tell us?" Vance looked gently toward her. "Shame usually comes before truth." Frank took a step back, gripping the counter for balance. His mind was working quickly now, not emotionally but mechanically, like gears turning, connecting dots he hadn't known were related. Vance continued. "There's another piece. Yesterday, I reviewed public records. Your son recently submitted a preliminary inquiry about power of attorney documents for you and Mrs. Mercer." Maggie's eyes widened. "Power of what?" Frank's voice came out hoarse. "When did he do that?" "A few weeks ago," Vance replied. "Around the same time you two mentioned he started acting differently." The house fell silent. Frank looked to Maggie, whose trembling hand rose to cover her mouth. "He did ask me," she whispered. "He brought papers and said they were just in case something ever happened. But I didn't sign. Something felt wrong. I didn't know why, but it didn't feel like Tyler. Not really." Frank felt the breath leave his lungs. Not in defeat, but in clarity. Everything, the tension, the sudden hostility, the slap, the demand for an apology, the false report, all of it was beginning to take shape. "This wasn't a moment of anger," Frank said quietly. "It was strategic." Vance nodded. "That's my suspicion. Brianna may be attempting to build a case that you and Mrs. Mercer are unstable, aggressive, or unsafe. If she creates enough doubt, gaining power of attorney, or access to assets, becomes much easier. Maggie pressed her palms together, her voice trembling. Frank, do you think Tyler knew? Do you think he's part of this? Frank didn't answer. He couldn't. Not yet. But the truth was forming like a storm on the horizon, dark, inevitable, and coming straight for them. Vance exhaled slowly. More will come out, and when it does, you need to be prepared. Frank nodded, feeling something cold settle into him. Not fear, not anger. Resolve. The kind that didn't fade. The kind that fought back. And as Vance left the house, the truth echoed loud inside him. This was no accident. This was a plan. The first sign of escalation didn't arrive through a knock at the door or a message from the police. It arrived online, quiet, poisonous, disguised as concern. Frank found out because Carl knocked on the door early that morning, holding his phone out like it was something contaminated. "You need to see this," Carl said, tight-lipped. On the screen was a neighborhood forum, the kind residents used to trade lawn care tips and warn about porch thefts. Except now Brianna had posted a long, emotional paragraph describing a traumatic encounter with her in-laws. She never used Frank or Maggie's names, but the details were unmistakable. An elderly couple with a history of emotional instability. A woman who lashes out when she feels threatened. A man who becomes aggressive without warning. There were sympathy comments, people offering prayers, people saying they'd noticed strange behavior from the Mercers too. Frank's stomach twisted as he scrolled. Maggie walked into the room just as Carl cleared his throat. "You should prepare yourselves. It's going to spread." She leaned forward and read only a few lines before clapping her hand over her mouth. Oh God, why would she say these things? Why would she do this? Frank took the phone from her gently. "Because she's trying to paint you as dangerous," he said, "trying to build a story." Maggie's eyes filled with tears, but behind them was something worse, fear. That fear only deepened when Tyler's voice appeared on their voicemail later that afternoon. Frank played the first message on speaker, and the words hit them like physical blows. "You've ruined our lives," Tyler's voice barked through the speaker. "Brianna is terrified of you. She can't sleep. She's having nightmares because of Mom. I hope you're happy." Frank deleted it before Maggie could hear it a second time. But the voicemails continued, short, sharp, cruel bursts of anger. In one, Tyler accused Maggie of gaslighting Brianna. In another, he accused Frank of being aggressive and controlling. Each message was colder than the last, like Tyler had shed the last pieces of the boy they raised. By the end of the week, Maggie barely slept. Twice Frank found her sitting on the edge of the bed in the dark, gripping her chest with trembling fingers. Her breathing came in quick, shallow bursts, panic attacks she tried to hide. "It feels like I can't breathe," he whispered one night. "Frank, what if they make people believe them? What if they take our son away from us completely?" Frank held her until her breathing steadied, but inside he felt helpless rage building. Something had to change. They couldn't keep waiting for Brianna's next blow. The next morning, he picked up the phone and called Lucas Brandt. Brandt didn't bother with small talk. "I've been expecting your call," he said, voice low and confident, the tone of a man who'd seen uglier family wars than this one. "Detective Vance gave me a heads up. Tell me everything." Frank did, the complaint, the online posts, the voicemails, the power of attorney request. Brandt listened without interrupting, letting the picture form in full. When Frank finished, Brandt exhaled slowly. "All right, Frank, I need you to hear me carefully." "I'm listening." "They're building a narrative, one that paints you and Maggie as unstable. If they can get enough people to believe it, they could argue for control over your assets, savings, property titles, even medical decisions if something happened to either of you." Maggie, who had been listening from the doorway, froze. "Control over our everything." Brandt didn't sugarcoat it. "Yes, and with the debts they're carrying, that would solve a lot of their problems." Frank felt the anger inside him sharpen, no longer chaotic but focused. "What do we do?" "We move first," Brant replied. "Secure assets. Make sure nothing can be touched without your explicit approval. I'll file protective documentation, but I need you to act quietly." Quietly, that part mattered. Frank spent the rest of the afternoon doing exactly that. He called the bank. He separated joint accounts. He added additional verification layers. He spoke with the credit union about their cabin, confirming that the deed would remain solely in his and Maggie's names. He stored copies of important documents in a locked safe they rarely used. Each action felt like placing bricks around their home, building a wall piece by piece. By evening, Maggie watched him with weary eyes. "Do you think this is really necessary?" she asked softly. Frank looked at her bruise, now fading but still present like a ghost under the skin. "Yes," he said, "because this isn't about a slap anymore. It's about everything we've built. They're trying to take it apart." Maggie nodded slowly, but her fear didn't fade. Instead, it deepened. The kind that weighed on her shoulders, bending her posture, thinning her voice. And as night fell, Frank felt the temperature shift in the house, not physically but emotionally. More fragile, more tense, more brittle. Tempers were rising, loyalties breaking, a family tearing down the middle in a way no one could have predicted. And deep down, Frank knew. The fracture had only begun. Frank hadn't meant to come home early. He'd left the hardware store's alumni breakfast sooner than planned, the conversation turning too cheerfully nostalgic while his own life felt like it was collapsing in slow motion. Driving home through the gray Portland morning, he tried to quiet his mind, but the silence in the truck only magnified every worry. Maggie's panic attacks, Tyler's venomous voicemails, Brianna's online smear campaign. It was like the world had tilted and refused to straighten again. When he pulled into the driveway, something felt off. Maggie's car was there, as expected, but the curtains in the living room were slightly parted, just enough for someone to look out. Maggie never left them like that. Frank stepped inside quietly. At first he thought he'd imagined it, the faint shuffle of movement down the hallway, then the soft thud of something closing. He froze. Someone was in the house. "Maggie," he called out gently. No answer. He moved down the hall slowly, listening. Halfway to the bedroom, he heard it again, the faint slide of a drawer, a rustle of papers. Frank rounded the corner and stopped cold. Brianna was standing at Maggie's desk. Not sitting, not waiting, not pacing nervously. Digging. Her hand was inside the top drawer, rifling through envelopes and documents as if she owned the place. Her phone was propped on the edge of the desk, the camera light blinking, recording, scanning. Frank's stomach twisted. "What the hell are you doing in my house?" he asked, voice low but unmistakably sharp. Brianna jerked around so fast a stack of papers fell to the floor. She pressed a hand to her chest like she was startled, too performed. "Oh my God, Frank," she gasped. "You scared me. I came to talk to you and Maggie to clear the air." Frank stared at her unmoving, by going through her desk. Her eyes flitted briefly to the open drawer, then back to him. "I wasn't going through anything. I was just tidying. I thought it looked cluttered." Frank let out a humorless laugh. "Right, you break into my house to tidy." She bristled immediately. "I didn't break in. Maggie let me in earlier." "Maggie is at the Grok. Uri store," Frank said flatly. "She hasn't been home all morning." A flicker of panic crossed Brianna's face, quick but real. Then she replaced it with indignation. "Well, maybe she forgot, I don't know. I came to talk things out. You've been painting me as some villain and—" "I didn't paint anything," Frank said, stepping closer. "I walked in on you going through my wife's drawers." Brianna's eyes hardened. "You don't get to speak to me like that. You've been intimidating from day one." "That's not going to work on me," Frank replied. "So let's hear it. What were you looking for?" She didn't answer. Instead, she grabbed her phone from the desk with a swift, defensive motion, as if protecting evidence. I don't owe you explanations. This family has been toxic to me since I married Tyler. Before Frank could respond, the front door swung open and Maggie stepped inside carrying grocery bags. She froze when she saw Brianna in the hall. "Brianna," she whispered, her voice quivering, What are you doing here?" Frank watched as guilt flickered through Maggie's eyes, an instinctive worry that she'd somehow caused this scene. Her hands trembled around the grocery bags. "I came to talk," Brianna said quickly, "but your husband started attacking me the moment he walked in." Frank's chest tightened, not from anger, from the exhausting predictability of the lie. "Maggie," he said, keeping his eyes on his wife, "she was going through your desk." Maggie looked from Frank to Brianna, her face crumpling with a mix of fear and disbelief. "Brianna, is that true?" Brianna scoffed, tossing her hair with practiced exasperation. "Of course not. Frank is twisting everything. He always does." Maggie swallowed hard. She looked shaken, but she didn't look away from Frank. "I believe him," she whispered. The words hit the air like a spark. Brianna's expression snapped, rage surfacing faster than she could hide it. "You'll regret siding against us," she hissed, stepping toward the door. "Both of you, I promise you're making this worse for yourselves." She stormed past them, slamming the door behind her so forcefully the frame rattled. The moment she was gone, Maggie leaned against the wall, breathing shakily. "Frank, this is spinning out of control." Frank guided her to a chair, trying to steady his own pulse. When his hands stopped trembling enough to hold his phone, he stepped into the kitchen and called Detective Vance. She answered on the third ring. "Mercer, what happened?" Frank kept his voice controlled, but the anger beneath it was unmistakable. "She was in our house, going through Maggie's desk, claiming she was here to talk, but lying through her teeth." Vance didn't sound surprised, not even a little. "Frank," she said, "I need you to understand something. Brianna has a pattern, a long one, manipulation, false narratives, creating chaos, then playing victim." Frank closed his eyes, the realization settling deeper. A pattern. Not an accident. Not a bad moment. A strategy. "Keep documenting everything," Vance said. "This is far from over." Frank hung up and returned to the living room, where Maggie sat staring at the door as if expecting it to burst open again. He sat beside her, placing a steadying hand over hers. But inside, one truth burned hotter than the rest. They had crossed another line. And he knew Brianna wasn't finished. Not even close. The letter arrived in a plain white envelope, no return address, no stamp other than the automated postage from the courthouse. Frank almost tossed it aside, thinking it was another piece of junk mail, until he saw his own name printed above the words, "Immediate legal notice." His stomach dropped. He opened it at the kitchen counter while Maggie dried dishes beside him. The paper shook faintly as he unfolded it, the official seal staring back at him like a warning. A restraining order. Against him. Filed by his own son. For a moment, Frank didn't breathe. He read the lines twice, but the words refused to change. Tyler was claiming that Frank had threatened violence against him and against Brianna. The accusation hit Frank harder than anything Brianna had thrown so far, because this wasn't just strategy. It was betrayal. Pure, devastating betrayal. Maggie noticed the color drain from his face. "Frank, what is it?" she asked softly. He handed her the paper without speaking. She skimmed it and her hand flew to her mouth. "No," she whispered, voice cracking. "No, he would never. Tyler wouldn't say this. He knows you. He knows you're not violent." Frank swallowed, his jaw tightening. "He filed it yesterday." Maggie sank into a chair as if her legs had given out. Why would he do that? Why would he? Before he could answer, Frank's phone buzzed on the counter. A notification flashed across the screen. a message from an unknown number. But he didn't need to open it to know whose voice waited inside. He clicked play on the voicemail. Brianna's voice filled the kitchen, shaky, breathless, trembling with fake fear. "Frank said he was going to hurt me," she told the recorder. "He threatened my life. I'm scared he'll come after me. We need protection." Frank closed his eyes. The anger that rose wasn't explosive. It was cold, controlled. A kind of pain he hadn't felt since his years in the Marines, when a man had to swallow the unthinkable and keep moving anyway. Maggie's voice shook. "She's lying, Frank, she's lying. She's lying, and he believes her." He put a steady hand on her shoulder. "I know." "But Tyler," her voice broke. "He knows you. Never lay a hand on anyone, not even when you were furious. You never even raised your voice at him as a kid." Frank nodded slowly, and yet he signed it. Maggie stood abruptly and walked to the dining table, pulling out a stack of blank notepaper. Her hands trembled so badly she could barely hold the pen. "I'm writing a statement. I'm telling them everything. You didn't threaten anyone. You didn't touch anyone. You didn't do anything wrong." "Maggie." She cut him off, tears spilling. "You protected me, that's all you did. I won't let them twist this." She began writing, each word punctuated by the soft quiver of her breath. It took her several tries, the pen slipping, her hand shaking, but she finished it. The statement was heartfelt, raw, a defense of the man she'd known for nearly 50 years. When she handed it to Frank, her eyes were red and swollen. "Please make sure Detective Vance gets this." Frank didn't hesitate. He called Vance immediately. When she answered, her voice carried that same steady professionalism, but underneath it was something else, concern. "I figured you'd be calling," she said. "I received a notification about the restraining order an hour ago." "You know it's false," Frank said. "You've spoken to us, you've seen everything." "I know," Vance replied gently. "And I've already opened an internal review of Brianna's statements. There are inconsistencies, big ones." "Like what?" Frank asked. "For one, her timeline doesn't match the report she filed last week, and she claims she has bruises from you grabbing her, but the photos she provided were dated a month earlier. Sloppy." Maggie let out a soft gasp from across the table. Vance continued, "I'm pulling surveillance footage from the pharmacy she claims she went to right after the alleged threat. If it doesn't match her story, that's one more crack." Frank leaned against the counter, grounding himself with one hand. "Thank you for not just taking her word." "You deserve the truth," Vance said. "And right now the truth is on your side. Keep documenting everything. This isn't over, not by a long shot." Frank ended the call feeling both steadier and heavier. He turned toward Maggie, who stood watching him with tear-filled eyes. The fear in her expression cut deeper than the accusation itself. "We'll get through this," Frank told her quietly. "Truth always shows." She nodded, but the sadness didn't leave her face. They sat in silence for several minutes, holding hands, both of them carrying the weight of a family tearing itself apart, when Frank's phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from Tyler. "Tyler, you brought this on yourself." Frank stared at the message, feeling the words burn into him in a way he would never forget. And with that single text, he understood what came next. The real war was just beginning. Frank had barely slept the night before. The restraining order, the cold text from Tyler, the sound of Maggie crying softly into her pillow, it all sat inside him like a weight he couldn't shift. He spent the morning trying to keep himself busy, fixing a loose hinge on the pantry door, wiping down the kitchen counters twice, anything to keep his thoughts from turning toward the worst possibilities. Around noon a firm knock sounded, not tentative, not neighborly, urgent. Frank opened the door to find Carl Jennings standing on the porch, his face drawn tight in a way Frank had never seen. Carl held a tablet in one hand, gripping it like the thing was nuclear. "Frank," he said, voice low, "we need to talk inside." Frank stepped aside immediately. Maggie, still fragile from the strain of the last few days, looked up from the couch. Carl didn't waste time. He set the tablet on the coffee table and tapped it awake. "I wasn't going to get involved," he began. "I figured it was family business. But after everything she's been posting online after the restraining order," he exhaled hard. "You need to see this." A video thumbnail filled the screen, Carl's porch camera. Frank felt his chest tighten. From the night of the dinner. Carl nodded. "It caught everything. The angle isn't perfect, but the audio is clear enough." He hit play. Frank's stomach twisted as he watched their front walkway appear on the screen, the warm glow of his porch light illuminating the scene. Tyler and Brianna stood outside their door, Maggie greeting them with that gentle warmth she always carried. "Tea." Then the door closed, and the muffled voices began. The audio wasn't crystal clear, but it didn't need to be. Brianna's sharp criticisms, Maggie's soft responses, Tyler's silence. And then, a slap. It echoed through the tiny speakers, sharp and undeniable. Maggie gasped at the sound, even now. Frank reached for her hand instinctively. Carl paused the video before anyone had to hear more. "There's no universe," Carl said, "where that can be twisted into self-defense." Frank swallowed, staring at the frozen frame of Brianna's contorted face. This proves everything." Carl nodded again, but he wasn't finished. "There's more." He pulled up a second video, timestamped 2 weeks earlier. Jan 2. This time the footage showed Brianna creeping up the Mercers' driveway in the fading afternoon light. She was alone. No Tyler. No car pulling up. She glanced over her shoulder twice, then moved toward the side gate. Frank leaned forward, his heartbeat thudding in his ears. The camera clearly captured her slipping into the backyard, then reappearing several minutes later carrying something small, papers, envelopes. It was impossible to tell, but the image was unmistakable. Brianna trespassing. And snooping. Maggie's voice cracked as she whispered, "She was here before. Frank, she was in our yard." Carl pressed pause and nodded grimly. "I didn't look at the footage earlier because I didn't know there was anything to look for, but when all this started, I went back." Frank felt a deep, cold understanding settle into him. This wasn't chaos. This wasn't a fight that got out of hand. This was a pattern. Carl cleared his throat. "I already emailed both videos to Detective Vance. She should have them by now." As if summoned by the words, Frank's phone buzzed. Vance's name lit the screen. He answered immediately, "Detective." Her voice carried an energy he hadn't heard before, focused, sharp, almost relieved. "Mr. Mercer, I just received footage from your neighbor. I'm reviewing it now, but I can already tell you this changes everything. It confirms assault. It confirms trespassing, and it contradicts Brianna's entire narrative." Frank felt the breath leave him, not in defeat but in something closer to cautious hope. "Will it help with the restraining order?" he asked. "Yes," Vance said firmly. "And more than that, it helps establish a pattern of manipulation and falsified claims. I'm handing copies to your attorney as well." As if on cue, another call buzzed in. "Lucas Brandt." Frank switched over. "Frank," Brandt said without preamble, "I just saw the footage. It's solid. Clean timestamps, clear visuals, unambiguous actions. We can use this in court, in hearings, anywhere." Frank's throat tightened. "So we're not defenseless." "Not anymore." Brandt's voice held the steel of a man who'd just been handed leverage. "We're going to take this step by step, but this," he paused, "this is your countermove." When the calls ended, Frank sank onto the couch beside Maggie. She was clutching a pillow against her chest, her eyes glassy with fear and something else, guilt. She turned to him slowly. "Frank, if we use this footage, if we take Brianna to court, Tyler will never forgive us." Frank's heart twisted at the truth in her words. He had raised that boy. He had loved him through scraped knees, heartbreaks, graduations, adulthood. And now he was preparing to use evidence that would destroy the narrative his son clung to. "I know," he whispered. Maggie's voice was barely audible. "I don't want to lose him." Frank looked at the paused image on the tablet. Brianna's hand mid-swing, Maggie recoiling. "You didn't choose this," he said. "She did." But even as he spoke, his chest ached with a grief deeper than anger, because he had never imagined, never even considered, that he would one day have to defend his family from his own son's household. Carl stood to leave, nodding solemnly. "You two aren't alone. Whatever comes next, I'm here." When he left, the house fell into a heavy silence. Frank looked at Maggie, then at the evidence sitting on the coffee table. For the first time since the nightmare began, they had something more than fear. They had proof. But proof came with consequences. And as Frank exhaled slowly, one truth settled into him like a weight. The countermove had begun. Detective Erica Vance had learned long ago that timing was everything. People lied when they felt cornered, rehearsed when they felt watched, stiffened when their spouse hovered near them. But catch a person alone, truly alone, and the truth had a way of slipping through the cracks. So when she saw Tyler Mercer stepping out of his car in the courthouse parking lot, alone, shoulders hunched like he was carrying something heavier than the cold morning air, she didn't wait. She approached him calmly, hands tucked into her jacket pockets, her voice low and professional. "Tyler," she called out, "got a minute?" He froze at the sound of her voice. Not defensive, not confrontational, just tired, worn down in a way she hadn't seen before. He hesitated, glancing around the empty stretch of lot, then nodded. "Yes," he murmured, "okay." Vance guided him toward a quiet corner near the side entrance, just far enough that no one else could overhear, close enough that he wouldn't feel trapped. She watched the way he rubbed the back of his neck, the way his breath fogged in uneven wisps. He looked younger than his age, like a boy who'd wandered somewhere he didn't know how to leave. "I want to revisit your statement," Vance said gently. "Some details aren't matching up, and I think you know which ones I'm talking about." Tyler's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Vance continued, "Your wife's timeline contradicts footage we've collected. Her bruises predate the alleged incident, and the restraining order she filed," she paused, watching his reaction, "doesn't align with anything your father has ever been accused of before." Tyler swallowed. "Owed hard. I shouldn't be talking to you without Brianna here." "And yet you're here," Vance replied softly. Silence stretched between them. Tyler looked down at his shoes, breathing unevenly, as if deciding whether to keep carrying a lie that was now crushing him from the inside. Finally, something broke. His shoulders sagged, his face crumpled, and then the words tumbled out like they'd been locked behind his teeth for months. "She made me do it," he whispered. "Brianna, she pushed me to file the charges." Vance stayed perfectly still, giving him space to continue. Tyler ran a trembling hand through his hair. "She said if I didn't, she'd leave. She said she'd take everything. She kept telling me that my parents were trying to poison her against me, that they hated her, that they wanted me to fail." His breath hitched. "And I believed her. I believed every word." Vance watched him carefully. "Tyler, false charges are serious. You need to be clear." He nodded rapidly, almost frantically. I know, but she manipulates things, twists them. She convinced me my dad was dangerous, that Mom was emotionally abusing her. She kept saying she needed to be protected." Vance took a slow breath. She had seen frightened spouses before, ones shaped by control they didn't recognize until too late. But Tyler wasn't finished. He looked up at her with red-rimmed eyes and said quietly, "She's pregnant." The words landed like a sudden drop in the earth beneath them. Vance's expression didn't change on the surface, but her pulse quickened. Pregnancy wasn't just emotional leverage, it was legal leverage. Judges treated claims of danger differently when an unborn child was involved. Everything shifted. Every accusation, every protective order, every piece of evidence now carried weight in a different courtroom. Tyler saw her freeze and rushed to keep talking. She told me the baby needs to be safe from my parents. She said if we didn't build a record, if we didn't show that Frank and Mom were unstable, then the baby could be taken from us. She convinced me this was the only way. Vance's voice stayed steady, and you believed her. Tyler's eyes filled with tears. I didn't want to. God, I didn't want any of this. But she kept telling me I had to choose between her and them. He pressed his palms to his face, breathing shakily. I never wanted to hurt my parents. I didn't want to file anything. I didn't want to lie. But she said if I didn't protect her, if I didn't prove they were dangerous, she'd tell everyone I was a failure, that I couldn't defend my own family. Vance let the confession sink in. This wasn't triumph. This wasn't victory. This was a man unraveling. Tyler lowered his hands. Please, he said quietly, don't tell her I told you. If she finds out, I don't know what she'll do. She'll say I betrayed her. She'll say I don't love the baby. Vance nodded slowly. Your safety matters and your truth matters. I'll handle this carefully. Tyler exhaled, a sound that wasn't relief so much as defeat. When Vance left him standing there, shoulders folded inward, she knew exactly what she had to do next. And it wouldn't be easy, not on any of them. Hours later, Frank sat in the living room when her call came in. He listened silently as Vance recounted Tyler's confession. Every word, every crack in his voice, every devastating detail. When she finished, Frank didn't speak. Because the truth didn't feel like vindication. It felt like losing his son all over again. Detective Vance's call lingered in Frank's mind long after the conversation ended. Tyler's confession had rattled him in a way nothing else had. Not the restraining order, not the smear campaign, not even seeing Brianna rummaging through their desk. Hearing his son break down, admit lies, admit pressure, admit fear. It twisted something inside Frank so sharply he couldn't breathe right for an hour afterward. But Vance had warned him before hanging up. Don't assume this stays quiet. Brianna is perceptive. She'll know something slipped. She was right. 2 days later, the storm hit. It started with a series of frantic texts from Tyler, half-finished sentences, apologies mixed with panic, messages that looked like someone typing between bursts of chaos. Tyler, please don't call Bri. Just stay out of. Dad, I think she knows I. Please don't answer if. Then nothing. Silence for hours. By late evening, Frank paced the living room while Maggie sat on the couch clutching a blanket tight around her shoulders. They didn't speak much. There wasn't anything left to say until they knew what was happening. The winter wind rattled the window panes, and every car that passed made Frank's nerves jolt. And then around 9, the doorbell rang. It wasn't the confident knock Brianna always used. It wasn't the polite tap of a neighbor. It was desperate, rapid, uneven, almost frantic. Frank opened the door. Tyler stood there, and the sight of him nearly sent Frank to the floor. His son's face was swollen along the cheekbone, a cut on his lip, a bruise blooming near his collarbone. His eyes, red, frantic, flicked over his shoulder as if he expected someone to jump out of the darkness. Dad, he choked out, I didn't know where else to go. Maggie gasped behind Frank and rushed forward, guiding Tyler inside before Frank could even speak. She cupped his face gently, her thumb brushing the bruise with devastating tenderness. Oh, sweetheart, what happened to you? She whispered. Tyler winced at her touch. She's been losing it ever since you talked to that detective. He looked at Frank with hollow eyes. She knows I said something. I don't know how, but she knows. Maggie guided him to the couch, her voice breaking. Sit down, you're safe here. Tyler shook his head quickly. No, not safe. She followed me earlier. She ransacked the apartment looking for my phone. She screamed for hours. She threw things, she broke a mirror. She kept saying you were turning me against her. She kept saying the baby could feel my betrayal. Maggie's entire body shuddered. Frank stepped closer, his voice low and controlled. "Tyler, did she do this to you?" Tyler didn't answer at first. He looked down at his hands, trembling, scraped, like he was ashamed of them. Finally, he nodded. "It was just she got upset. I tried to calm her down. She grabbed my shirt and pushed me and I hit the wall. She didn't mean to." Frank's jaw tightened with a soundless snap. "Stop, do not defend her." Tyler flinched. Maggie turned toward Frank. "Please let him talk." But Frank couldn't hold it in any longer. "He is talking, Maggie, and she's hurting him. She's hurting all of us." Tyler ran a hand through his hair, shaking. "I don't know what to do. If I leave, she'll say I abandoned her and the baby. She'll tell everyone I'm dangerous. She'll take the baby away from me. She said she'd make sure I never see my child." Maggie sat beside him and took his hand gently. "Tyler, you can't stay with someone who scares you." His voice cracked. "She's pregnant, I have to protect her." Frank stepped forward, unable to stay silent. "Protecting her doesn't mean letting her destroy you." Tyler looked up at him with something like a plea. "Dad, you don't understand. If I leave her, she'll break apart." Frank's voice dropped to a level so calm it carried its own gravity. "And if you stay, you will." The room went still. Tyler shook his head again, backing away from his father's gaze. "I can't leave. Not while she's pregnant. I can't let my kid grow up without a father. I can't lose them." Maggie squeezed his hand. "You wouldn't lose the baby. There are laws, there are protections." But Tyler pulled away sharply. "You don't know her. She'll twist everything. She'll say I'm unstable. She'll use every lie she's already built." Frank exhaled slowly, the truth settling into him with a cold weight. Tyler wasn't just scared. He was trapped. Not physically, emotionally, mentally, strategically. Exactly how Brianna wanted. As Tyler sat shaking on their couch, Maggie wrapped her arms around him, her soft voice trying to comfort him even after everything he'd done to them. Frank watched them, feeling both heartbreak and fury churning beneath his chest. "You can stay here tonight," Maggie whispered. "Please, just rest. We'll figure it out together." Tyler hesitated, then nodded weakly. He leaned into his mother's embrace like he had when he was small. Frank stood a few steps away, watching his son crumble under the weight of someone else's madness, and one truth anchored itself deep inside him. Brianna wasn't just manipulative. She was spiraling, out of control, and the danger was no longer approaching. It had arrived. The night Tyler stayed at their house should have brought relief, but instead it settled over Frank and Maggie like a temporary ceasefire, fragile, trembling, certain to shatter. Tyler fell asleep on the couch sometime after midnight, exhausted from fear and shame. Maggie draped a blanket over him and sat nearby, watching him the way she used to when he was sick as a child, a mother's instinct overriding every wound he'd caused. Frank stayed awake, pacing softly in the hallway. He knew something was coming. He could feel it in the tense quiet of the house, in the way Tyler tossed in his sleep, in the way the night itself felt wound too tight. And just after dawn, the explosion arrived. A car screeched into the driveway, tires crunching gravel, engine growling like an animal. Frank moved quickly to the window, dread already tightening his chest. Brianna. Her door flew open so violently it bounced back, nearly hitting her. She stormed up the walkway, hair disheveled, eyes wild, wearing sweats and a hoodie like she'd driven there without thinking. She slammed her fists against the front door. "Tyler," she shrieked. "Tyler, open the door right now." Tyler jolted awake at the sound, his face draining of color. "Oh God," he whispered. Dad, what do I do?" Before Frank could answer, Brianna began pounding harder, her voice cracking through the house like a siren. I know you're in there. How dare you leave me alone all night? How dare you run away from me?" Frank stepped into the entryway and opened the inner door but kept the security chain latched. Brianna's face appeared in the narrow gap, twisted with rage and something unhinged. "Move," she snarled. "I need to talk to my husband." Frank kept his voice steady. "Brianna, you need to leave, now." She shoved the door so hard the chain strained. "Don't you tell me what to do. You've been poisoning him, turning him against me. You ruined him." Tyler appeared behind Frank, trembling. "Brianna, please stop yelling." She tried to wedge her fingers through the crack in the door. "Come home, right now. You're not staying with them. They're trying to destroy us." Maggie rushed forward, fear shaking her voice. "Frank, she's going to break the door." "Stay back," Frank said quietly. Brianna shoved again, unhinged, her nails scraping against the wood. Let me in right now." Maggie's voice rose, breaking. "Frank, I'm calling 911. Brianna heard it and lost what little control she had left. "Call them," she screamed. "I want them here. I want everyone to know what you're doing." But the way she kicked the bottom of the door, the way she yanked at the handle with both hands, even Tyler stepped back in fear. Maggie grabbed the phone with shaking fingers. 911, yes, please, we need officers. A woman is trying to force her way into our home." Brianna's face contorted. "You liar, you fraud, you're trying to steal MY family." Frank closed the door just enough to protect Maggie, holding the handle firmly as Brianna kicked it again, shrieking. Tyler cowered behind him, covering his ears, tears streaking down his bruised face. Within minutes, police cars pulled into the driveway, lights flashing, tires crunching. 2 officers approached quickly. Brianna spun toward them, screaming, "They're keeping my husband hostage. They're dangerous." But Detective Vance stepped out of the second car, her presence like a wall of steel. She took one look at Brianna's manic expression, the marks on the door, the way Frank stood shielding Maggie. Then she spoke sharply. "Brianna Mercer, you are under arrest for trespassing and harassment." Brianna's scream cracked into a sob. "No, no, you can't. I'm pregnant. Hes mine." She thrashed as the officers took her arms, her voice rising into something feral. Tyler stumbled onto the porch, shaking. When Brianna saw him, her rage sharpened. "Tyler," she screamed, "how dare you do this to me? How dare you turn on your own family?" Tyler flinched as if struck. Vance led the officers toward the patrol car, but Brianna craned her neck, fighting their grip. "This is your father's fault, all of it." Tyler's face crumpled. "Brianna, please stop." And then the final blow came. "You ruined MY family," he screamed at Frank. The words hit harder than any fist could have. Maggie gasped, pressing a hand to her chest. Frank stood still, absorbing it, feeling something inside him collapse in slow motion. As Brianna was shoved into the squad car, still screaming, Maggie began to sob uncontrollably, heavy, broken cries that echoed through the cold morning air. Frank put his arms around her, holding her tightly as she trembled against him. But his eyes stayed on Tyler. His son stood there on the porch, lost, torn, and furious, yet unable to see the truth through Brianna's storm. And in that moment, Frank felt the deepest kind of agony. Not the pain of being hated. The pain of losing a son who was still standing right in front of him. The courthouse felt colder than Frank expected, sterile hallways, pale walls, a faint chemical smell that clung to every doorway. Maggie clutched his arm as they walked toward the courtroom, her steps small and careful, as if afraid the floor might give way beneath her. Tyler walked ahead of them with his attorney, shoulders rounded, refusing to look back. He hadn't spoken a word to his parents since the morning Brianna was arrested. Shame clung to him like a shadow. Inside, the courtroom was already buzzing. Lawyers shuffled papers, clerks arranged files, a judge's assistant whispered instructions at the bench. And there, at the plaintiff's table, sat Brianna. Her hair was neatly curled. Her outfit soft and maternal, pastel sweater, loose skirt, hands folded protectively over her stomach. To anyone walking in, she looked like a fragile, expectant mother seeking safety. But her eyes, sharp, calculating, twitching at the edges, told a different story. As Frank and Maggie took their seats, Brianna leaned toward her attorney and whispered something with a trembling lip. The attorney nodded solemnly, casting a sympathetic glance in her direction. Maggie tensed beside Frank. Brant arrived moments later, planting a firm hand on Frank's shoulder. "Stay calm," he murmured. "We have the truth, that's more than they have." When the judge entered and the room rose, the tension thickened. Everyone sat. Then Brianna began. She stood slowly, as if every movement caused her pain, and approached the center of the courtroom. Her voice quivered with rehearsed fragility. "Your Honor," she said, "I'm here because I'm afraid. I'm afraid for myself and for my unborn child." Maggie's breath hitched, Frank's jaw clenched. Brianna continued, "Frank Mercer is a threat to us. He's large, aggressive, unpredictable. He lunged at me during a family dispute, screamed that he'd make me pay, and tried to force his way into our home later that same night." The courtroom murmured. Brianna pressed her hands to her stomach dramatically. "I fear," she whispered, "that he could harm my baby." Frank felt something break inside him, not anger but a deep, guttural ache he hadn't expected. Maggie's fingers dug into his hand. Brant rose immediately. "Your Honor, we're ready to present evidence." The judge nodded. "Proceed." Brant started with the footage, Carl's porch camera, the slap, the audio, Brianna striking Maggie without provocation. The judge leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowing. Next came the January trespassing video. Brianna creeping around the property, rummaging where she had no right to be. Brianna stiffened in her seat, the mask slipping for a split second. Brant continued, playing the cruel voicemails Tyler had left, only the parts that directly contradicted Brianna's claims. He handed over screenshots of Brianna's posts, her online accusations, her patterns of shifting narratives. Finally, Brant called witnesses. Carl, steady and clear, describing what he heard and saw. Maggie, voice trembling but honest, explaining the fear, the panic attacks, the bruises. And then Detective Vance. She approached the stand with calm authority, file in hand, gaze fixed straight ahead. "Detective Vance," Brant began, "is it true that during your investigation you found inconsistencies in the plaintiff's claims?" "Yes," Vance said, "significant ones." Brianna's attorney objected, but the judge waved it off. Vance continued, "The plaintiff's reported timeline does not match surveillance footage. Her injuries, which she attributed to Mr. Mercer, were dated weeks before the incident. Her account of the alleged threat also conflicts with statements from multiple witnesses." Brianna's fingernails dug into her palms. And Vance added, "She has a documented pattern of manipulating narratives to portray herself as a victim." A ripple stirred through the courtroom. Brianna's face reddened, anger, not embarrassment, her jaw tightening as she whispered something harsh to her attorney. Tyler sat stiffly at the end of their table, staring at his hands. He refused to look at his mother. He refused to look at anyone. It was the silence of someone drowning. When the judge finally spoke, the room quieted to a breath. "I have reviewed the evidence. There are clear discrepancies in the plaintiff's claims. The court finds insufficient grounds to uphold a restraining order against Mr. Mercer." Brianna's head snapped upward. The judge continued, "Furthermore, due to concerns about the plaintiff's behavior and the conflicting statements, I am ordering a psychological evaluation to assess her emotional stability during this pregnancy." Gasps echoed. Brianna stood abruptly. "This is outrageous. I'm the victim here." "Mrs. Mercer," the judge said sharply, "sit down." "She didn't." Instead, she glared at Frank with an expression that stripped away every layer of sweetness and softness she'd performed that morning. Raw hatred flashed through her eyes, undeniable, naked, exposed. Everyone saw it. Everyone. Her attorney tugged her sleeve. "Brianna," he hissed, "sit." But she stayed standing, chest rising and falling in sharp bursts, her facade collapsing like wet paper. And just like that, her mask cracked publicly. The judge continued. "Until the evaluation is complete, temporary protective provisions are granted to Frank and Margaret Mercer. Brianna Mercer is not permitted to contact them, enter their property, or engage in further harassment." Brianna's mouth opened, but her attorney pulled her down forcibly into her seat, whispering urgently. Tyler stared at her, really stared, and something inside him shifted, visible even from across the room. Not fully, not enough, but a fracture, a doubt. Frank saw it. Maggie saw it. And Brianna saw it too, which made her expression darken even more. When the session adjourned, the courtroom buzzed with murmurs. Vance gave Frank a slight nod. Brant clapped his shoulder, murmuring, "This was a big step." But Frank didn't feel victorious. Not even close. As he watched Tyler rise hesitantly from his seat, torn between the truth and the woman unraveling beside him, Frank felt an ache so deep it hollowed him out. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Frank wasn't expecting a knock that morning, certainly not the soft, hesitant one that barely reached through the quiet of the house. He'd been tightening the screws on the back porch railing, trying to keep his hands busy while his mind replayed the courtroom scene over and over. Maggie was inside folding laundry, humming softly in a shaky attempt at normalcy. When Frank opened the front door, Tyler stood on the porch. Alone. He looked smaller somehow, like the weeks of chaos had carved something out of him that hadn't yet grown back. His shoulders sagged beneath a worn jacket, and his eyes, tired, red around the edges, flicked up at his father with a mixture of fear and shame. "Dad," he said quietly, "can I come in?" Frank stepped aside. He didn't say a word, didn't trust himself to. Tyler walked into the living room like it belonged to a past version of himself, a place he wasn't sure he deserved to stand in anymore. He sat on the edge of the couch, hands clasped so tightly his knuckles whitened. Frank stayed standing. After a long, strained silence, Tyler spoke. I'm sorry," he whispered, "for the restraining order, for saying you threatened her. I shouldn't have done that. I knew it wasn't true. I wasn't thinking straight." F. Rank felt the apology land, but it didn't soften him. Not yet. He folded his arms, watching his son struggle for breath between words. Tyler ran a trembling hand over his face. "She told me I had to file it, that it was the only way to protect her and the baby. She said if I didn't, she'd leave, that I'd lose her. I thought I was doing the right thing." Frank finally sat across from him, elbows on his knees. His voice came out low, controlled. "Tyler, she lied about all of it. You know that now." Tyler nodded weakly, but there wasn't conviction behind it, only conflict. "She's hurting," he murmured. "She feels like everyone is against her. She's pregnant and emotional and scared, and I can't just abandon her, Dad. I can't walk away from her while she's like this." Frank's jaw tightened. "She tried to destroy us." The words hung in the air, heavy and accusing. Tyler flinched. "She wasn't trying to destroy you. She spirals. When she feels threatened, she lashes out. When she's scared, she makes bad decisions. I know it's wrong, but she's not evil. She's just dangerous," Frank finished quietly. Tyler's eyes filled with tears. "She's hurting," he insisted again, though even he didn't seem certain he believed himself. "She needs help, and I don't know how to give it." Frank leaned back, studying his son. This man, this confused, terrified man, was not the son Frank had raised to be steady, honest, grounded. This was someone lost, Someone who'd been twisted by months, maybe years, of fear and manipulation. Someone who had built his world around a single person and now didn't know how to move when that person began to fall apart. Tyler looked up suddenly, wiping at his eyes. "I'm scared, Dad." The confession came out broken. "I'm scared of everything. Of the baby coming, of being a father, of messing everything up, of not being good enough. Brianna said if I didn't protect her, it meant I wasn't ready to be a dad, and I believed her. I'm terrified she's right." Frank opened his mouth, but before he could speak, Maggie appeared quietly in the doorway. She must have heard the trembling in Tyler's voice, or maybe she'd simply felt it. Instinct always guided her toward pain like a compass. She walked over slowly, heart first, and sat beside her son. Without waiting for permission, she wrapped her arms around him the way she used to when he was little and scared of thunder. Tyler didn't resist. He collapsed into her, burying his face in her shoulder, shaking with sobs he hadn't let himself release in months. Maggie stroked his hair softly. "Oh, sweetheart," she whispered, voice cracking with love and grief. "You're going to be a good father. You have a good heart. You always have. You're just overwhelmed. Anyone would be." Frank watched them, mother and son folded into each other, clinging like survivors of a storm, and felt his own chest tighten. There was love in the room, but there was damage too. And he couldn't pretend that an apology erased months of betrayal. He couldn't pretend that his son's fear justified the decisions that had nearly destroyed their lives. He couldn't pretend he was ready to forgive. Not yet. So he stayed silent. Because in that moment, he wasn't sure forgiveness had been earned. The room felt still, heavy, suspended. And as Tyler cried into Maggie's arms, Frank realized with a painful clarity. This confrontation wasn't an end. It was another fracture. One that would decide which way the family broke next. The courthouse had a different weight that morning, thicker, heavier, as if every echo in the hallway knew something was coming. Frank felt it the moment he and Maggie stepped through the metal detectors. He walked slowly beside her, keeping a steadying hand at her back. Tyler trailed behind them, silent, hollow-eyed, as if he were moving through fog. Detective Vance met them outside the courtroom with a folder tucked firmly under her arm. She didn't smile. She didn't soften her expression. There was urgency in the way she pulled Frank aside. "The evaluation records came in," she said quietly, "along with something else." Frank saw something flicker in her eyes, something she rarely showed. Hesitation. "What is it?" he asked. Vance didn't answer, not yet. "The judge has to unseal it first. You'll hear it in session." Maggie's fingers tightened around Frank's arm. Tyler looked between them with a nervous swallow. "Is it bad?" he asked, voice thin. Vance didn't look at him. "Just be prepared." They took their seats inside the courtroom, and Frank felt the tension settle across the room like a storm cloud. Brianna sat at the plaintiff's table with her attorney, dressed in soft beige, her hair perfectly curled, her posture fragile. She kept one hand on her stomach, the other clutching a tissue. To everyone else, she looked like a wounded mother fighting for her unborn child. But when her eyes met Frank's, the softness vanished. Hatred burned there, hot, unmasked, venomous. The judge entered. Everyone rose, then sat. Papers shuffled. A clerk brought forward a sealed envelope and placed it on the bench before the judge. Vance straightened in her seat. Brant leaned slightly forward. Frank felt Maggie's breath catch beside him. The judge adjusted his glasses. "We are reconvening to address items obtained from the plaintiff's psychological evaluation," he said. "At the request of law enforcement and counsel, certain medical documents are being reviewed for relevance to the case." Brianna's attorney stood. "Your Honor, we object to the release of private medical." The judge raised a hand. "The request has been approved. Sit down." The attorney obeyed. The judge broke the seal on the envelope. Every sound in the courtroom vanished. Tyler gripped the edge of his chair, knuckles white. The judge read in silence for several seconds, his brows knitting slowly, deeply, into an expression that told Frank something unprecedented sat inside that file. Then the judge cleared his throat. This evaluation includes, among other items, a paternity report. Frank saw Brianna's jaw clench. Tyler stiffened. Paternity? Why would there be? The judge continued. The test was ordered as part of the standard psychological and medical review, given the allegations of domestic threat during pregnancy. He inhaled slow, heavy. The results are conclusive. Tyler's voice came out a whisper. Your Honor, what does that mean? The judge looked directly at him. Mr. Mercer, the child your wife is carrying is not biologically yours. The words dropped into the courtroom like a detonation. Everything exploded at once. A gasp rippled across the room. Maggie pressed both hands to her mouth, tears springing instantly to her eyes. Frank felt the air rip out of his chest, not from shock at the result, part of him had suspected, but from the devastation on his son's face. Tyler went pale. Not white. Gray. As if the blood had been vacuumed out of him in a single second. He stared at the judge, unblinking, unmoving, as if the world had tilted under his feet and left him suspended without gravity. That can't, his voice cracked. That can't be right, there must be some mistake. But Brianna's reaction killed any hope of denial. She made a sound, a strangled, inhuman whimper, and then collapsed forward, screaming. No, 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 she shrieked, grabbing at the arms of her chair, then at her attorney. Don't say that, don't you dare say that in front of them. Her attorney scrambled to steady her, but she shoved him away, wailing. The courtroom erupted, spectators whispering, clerks calling for order, the bailiff stepping forward. Tyler rose to his feet slowly, like a man waking inside a nightmare. Brianna, he whispered, tell me it's wrong, tell me it's wrong. She didn't answer him. Couldn't. Her screams dissolved into sobs, her entire body collapsing over itself, hands covering her face as if she could hide from the truth now laid bare under courtroom lights. Tyler stared at her like he'd never seen her before. Like every memory, every argument, every moment of devotion had just rewritten itself behind his eyes. Frank watched his son crumble, watched the foundation of his identity split open, and felt a deeper ache than any he'd carried before, because this wasn't victory, it wasn't vindication. It was heartbreak. Raw, brutal betrayal cutting straight through the boy he had raised. The judge pounded his gavel. Order, order in this court. But Brianna only screamed louder, her voice cracking under the weight of her own unraveling. You don't understand, she sobbed. You don't know what it's been like. I didn't have a choice. I didn't. Mrs. Mercer, sit down, the judge demanded. She shook her head violently, tears streaking her face. He was never there for me. He made me feel alone. I. The words collapsed into another guttural scream as two bailiffs approached. Tyler clutched the back of his chair, shaking. How long? He whispered. Brianna, how long have you? She didn't answer. She only screamed harder as the bailiffs lifted her from her seat, her arms flailing wildly, her voice cracking into raw, feral sounds. The entire courtroom watched, shock, disgust, disbelief swirling in the air. Frank kept his eyes on Tyler. His son looked like a man whose entire life had just been erased. He swayed slightly, catching himself on the table, breathing in shallow, broken bursts. Maggie reached for him across the aisle, tears pouring down her face. But Tyler didn't move. He was frozen, caught between betrayal and heartbreak, between what he'd believed and what was now undeniable. The judge struck the gavel one last time. Court will reconvene after recess, he announced. This matter is far from resolved. Frank knew he was right, because truth had finally emerged. But the fallout, that was just beginning. The courthouse emptied slowly after the explosion of truth. Frank and Maggie waited in the corridor while Tyler sat alone on a bench, hunched over, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor as though his entire world had fallen through it. The sound of Brianna's screams still echoed faintly through the walls, even after bailiffs dragged her away. The building felt colder than before, colder than any courtroom should feel. Detective Vance approached them first. She didn't speak right away. She simply exhaled like she was releasing the weight she'd carried for weeks. Finally, she broke the silence. "The district attorney reviewed the file," she said. "Given the evidence, Brianna will be charged formally within the next 48 hours. Maggie clutched Frank's arm. "Charged with what exactly?" Vance opened her folder. "Fraud, assault, false reporting, and depending on what else surfaces when we process her devices, possibly more." Maggie's breath caught. Frank saw guilt flicker across her eyes, like part of her still believed she had caused all this, even when the truth was undeniable. Vance went on, "You two have been through hell, but this is a step forward." Frank nodded, though the victory felt hollow, because a victory didn't fix everything. A victory didn't mend broken trust. A victory didn't rebuild a son. When Vance walked away, Tyler finally lifted his head. His eyes were rimmed red, not from anger this time, but from the kind of grief that burrowed deep and stayed there. "Dad," he whispered. The word barely held itself together. Frank approached slowly, unsure whether he wanted to comfort his son or collapse beside him. Tyler stood weakly, and when Frank reached him, the young man looked like he might crumble all over again. "Can I stay with you for a while?" Tyler asked, voice shaking. "I have nowhere else to go right now." It wasn't the words, it was the way he said them. Broken, defeated, empty. Maggie answered first, her voice warm and certain. "Of course you can, sweetheart. You're always welcome home." Frank didn't say anything. He stepped aside, letting Maggie wrap her arms around Tyler. The embrace was immediate, desperate. Tyler clung to her like he was afraid she'd disappear if he let go. They brought him home that evening. Tyler barely spoke on the drive. He stared out the window as the city lights blurred past, his reflection ghostly against the glass, his expression somewhere between disbelief and nausea. Frank glanced at him several times, wanting to offer something, comfort, guidance, anything, but nothing felt adequate. When they got to the house, Maggie made tea, the kind she used to make during thunderstorms when Tyler was young. Tyler held the warm mug between his palms without drinking, tears welling again. "I'm sorry," he finally said, voice cracking. "I'm so sorry for everything, for believing her, for what I said, for the restraining order, for all the things I said to you both. I don't know how I could have been so stupid." Maggie sat beside him immediately, placing her hand on his back. "You were manipulated, Tyler. She knew exactly how to control you. That doesn't make you stupid. It makes you human." But Tyler shook his head violently. "No, I let her convince me you were dangerous. I let her convince me Mom was the problem. I hurt you. I hurt both of you." Frank stood a few steps away, listening, the ache in his chest heavy. This apology was different from the others, raw, unfiltered, unguarded. It was the confession of a man who had finally seen the full extent of the damage he'd caused. After a moment, Maggie wrapped her arms around her son again. "I forgive you," she whispered. "I forgave you the moment you walked through our door." Tyler cried into her shoulder, the sound soft but devastating. Frank stayed silent. Because forgiveness wasn't something he could hand out like a reflex. It wasn't that simple. Not after months of betrayal. Not after being called dangerous. Not after watching Maggie hide bruises inflicted by a situation his son had helped fuel. He needed time. And Tyler seemed to understand that without Frank saying a word. When he finally lifted his head, he didn't reach for his father. He didn't expect anything. He simply nodded once, eyes wet, accepting the distance. The next morning, Brant arrived with paperwork. He laid folders neatly across the kitchen table and pushed his glasses up his nose. "We'll start the process of restoring your legal standing," Brandt said. "Getting the false claims wiped, securing your property records, clearing your name from anything she attempted to stain." Frank exhaled deeply. "Thank you." Brandt tapped one of the documents. "You've been dragged through a swamp of lies. This will undo most of it." "Most, not all. Some scars didn't vanish on paper." Maggie made coffee while Brandt and Frank reviewed the filings. Tyler lingered quietly in the living room, overhearing everything but saying nothing. His presence was both fragile and heavy, like a wound still bleeding beneath a fragile bandage. Later that afternoon, Detective Vance Cal. D with an update. Frank put her on speaker. "Brianna's facing multiple charges," Vance said. "We're still processing evidence from her phone. There's enough to keep the case strong." "How long will everything take?" Frank asked. "Months," Vance replied. "But the worst is over. You're on solid ground now." After she hung up, the house fell into a long, quiet stillness. Maggie sat with Tyler, talking softly, helping him sort through the emotional rubble. Frank watched from across the room, his son, broken but reachable, his wife, gentle even through her pain. Healing had begun. Slowly, unevenly, but undeniably. And as Frank stood there, absorbing the fragile peace settling over his home, he knew the road ahead would require patience, strength, and a kind of forgiveness he wasn't sure he possessed yet. But at least, they were finally walking it. Together. The weeks after Brianna's arrest passed in a slow, quiet rhythm that felt strangely foreign to the Mercer home. The chaos that had consumed their days, the shouting, the accusations, the police visits, the court hearings, finally faded into a distant hum. In its place came something gentler, though still fragile: space. Space to think. Space to breathe. Space to begin sorting through the wreckage Brianna had left behind. Tyler was the first to take a step toward rebuilding. On a gray Monday morning, he announced softly over breakfast that he'd scheduled his first therapy session. Maggie nearly teared up on the spot, but Frank only nodded, offering silent approval. Tyler needed this, not just to understand the last few months, but the years before them, the cracks Brianna had filled. The session left Tyler drained. He returned home with eyes red and shoulders slumped, but something in his expression was clearer, like he'd managed to push aside a layer of fog. "Therapist said I've been emotionally dependent my whole life," Tyler admitted that evening, sitting at the kitchen table. "Not just on Brianna, even before her. I guess I never really learned how to stand on my own." Maggie reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "It takes strength to admit that." Tyler swallowed. "She also said I've spent years feeling like I wasn't enough for anyone. And Brianna, she leaned into those insecurities. She made me feel like she was the only person who saw value in me." Frank listened quietly, arms folded. He'd known pieces of this, but hearing it spoken aloud, hearing his son expose wounds he'd carried since childhood, hit deeper than he expected. Tyler went on, voice trembling. "She made me believe I couldn't survive without her, and I let her. I let her make decisions for me. I let her isolate me. I let her convince me you were the problem. I don't know how I didn't see it." Frank exhaled slowly. "Because you trusted her," he said, "and trust isn't a weakness. It's something someone else can misuse." Tyler's gaze dropped. "Dad, I'm sorry for all of it. I should have." Frank held up a hand. "Not right now, just focus on getting better." Tyler nodded, relief and grief mixing in his eyes. Over the next few days, little changes appeared. Tyler began waking earlier, helping with breakfast without being asked, just like he had as a teenager when he wanted to feel useful. He fixed the loose balcony railing Frank had been meaning to get to. He cleaned the gutters even though it wasn't glamorous work. He even started reorganizing the basement shelves, mumbling to himself about finally doing something around here again. Every time Frank walked through the house and saw Tyler working, something inside him tightened, not painfully, but with the ache of remembering the boy he once knew. One evening after a long day, Maggie approached Frank with a quiet, hopeful smile. "I've been thinking," she said. "Maybe we should bring back Sunday dinners, nothing big, just the three of us, a chance to reconnect." Frank hesitated. The idea felt both comforting and dangerous. But when he glanced at Tyler, sitting in the living room, flipping through a therapy workbook with furrowed brows, it felt necessary. "Let's try it," he said. That Sunday dinner was awkward at first. Maggie fussed over the meal, Tyler nervously overseasoned the potatoes, and Frank found himself watching every interaction too closely, waiting for something to snap. But nothing did. They talked softly, about weather, about yard projects, about old family memories Maggie brought up to lighten the mood. And slowly, the corners of the past began to soften. 2 weeks later, the dinners felt more natural. Tyler laughed at one of Frank's dry jokes, really laughed, not the forced politeness of months past. Maggie teared up again, though she turned away to hide it. Frank noticed but didn't say anything. Small moments started slipping back into place. Tyler offering to take out the trash before Frank could get to it. Tyler fixing the back fence without being asked. Tyler asking his mother to teach him one of her old casserole recipes. Tyler pausing before leaving a room to say, "Good night, Dad." Tiny gestures, but each one a stitch mending what had been torn. One evening, after Tyler had gone upstairs, Frank found himself standing alone in the kitchen, hands resting on the counter as he thought about everything they'd survived. He still felt a distance between them, still felt the sting of betrayal when he remembered how quickly Tyler had believed Brianna's stories. But now, when he looked at his son, he didn't see the blindly loyal man who had once screamed at him outside the house. He saw someone climbing out of a psychological trap, someone bruised but trying, someone who finally recognized the truth and regretted the damage of not seeing it sooner. Maggie joined Frank quietly, slipping her arm around his waist. "He's coming back to us," she whispered. Frank nodded, staring at the soft glow from the hallway, little by little. "You still don't trust him," she said gently. Frank didn't answer immediately. He didn't need to, she knew. "I'm trying," he said finally. And that was the truth. Trust couldn't be rebuilt overnight, not after everything. But it could be rebuilt with time, with effort, with honesty, and Tyler was giving all three. Later that night, Frank paused outside Tyler's door. The light was on. He could hear his son speaking softly, a video call with his therapist, voice steady, words clearer, no tremor left. It was the first time Frank saw a glimpse of the man Tyler was becoming, stronger, more self-aware, slowly disentangling himself from the damage he once defended. And in that moment, Frank felt the shift. Not full forgiveness, but the beginning of trust. And maybe, just maybe, the beginning of hope. Brianna's trial ended on a crisp Thursday morning, the kind where the air felt clean in a way Frank hadn't experienced in months. The courtroom had been packed, spectators, reporters, people who'd followed every twist of the case. But when the judge read the final sentencing, everything else seemed to fade into background noise. "Given the severity of the charges," the judge said, voice firm and final, "the court sentences Brianna Mercer to a multi-year state sentence to be served immediately." Multi-year. The words hit the room like a long exhale, one the entire Mercer family had been holding. Brianna didn't scream this time. She didn't collapse or claw at the bailiffs. She simply stared forward, hollow and expressionless, like she had run out of places inside herself to break. When they cuffed her wrists and led her away, she didn't look at Frank, didn't look at Maggie, she didn't even look at Tyler. Tyler watched in silence, jaw clenched, face pale but composed. The moment the doors closed behind her, he closed his eyes, not in relief, in release. as if he were finally letting go of something he'd been gripping for too long. Later that afternoon, in a quiet corner outside the courthouse, Tyler stood before Frank with a manila folder in his hand. "I filed the paperwork," he said. His voice was steady, but there was a tremor underneath. "I'm legally severing all ties with her. Name, obligations, parental claims, everything. I can't be connected to her anymore." Frank nodded slowly. "You're doing the right thing." Tyler's eyes filled with a watery sheen, but he blinked it back. "I don't know who I was when I let her control me, but I don't want to be that man again." He hugged his mother, then turned to Frank with a look that held gratitude, grief, and something close to reverence. "Thank you," he whispered, "for not giving up on me." Frank didn't trust his voice enough to respond, so he simply laid a hand on his son's shoulder, firm, fatherly, grounding. That evening, Frank and Maggie packed 2 overnight bags and drove to their lakeside cabin. The trees along the water were still green, but hints of early autumn brushed the edges. The lake itself was calm, barely rippling, reflecting streaks of soft pink across the sky. It was the first stillness they'd felt in months. Inside, the cabin smelled of cedar and dust, untouched since spring. Frank opened the windows, letting in the cool air, while Maggie lit a small lamp and set their bags aside. The silence of the place was comforting, quiet without tension, soft without fear. They sat on the back deck overlooking the water, wrapped in blankets, sipping tea the way they had when they were young parents taking rare moments for themselves. For a long while they didn't speak. Then Maggie leaned her head against Frank's shoulder. "Do you feel it?" she asked softly. "Feel what?" "The peace." Frank looked out over the lake. The water reflected the moon in a long, gentle shimmer. For once, nothing tightened in his chest. Nothing threatened to come crashing back through their door. The danger had passed. The lies had been buried. "Yeah," he murmured, "I feel it." Maggie tucked her hand into his. "We're older now," she said quietly, "and everything feels heavier than it did when we were young. But we survived this, Frank, and Tyler, he's finding himself again. He's healing." Frank nodded. "He's working hard. I'm proud of him." Maggie smiled, her voice tender. "U.S. Avedas, you know." Frank's brow furrowed. "Maggie." "No." She turned toward him, her eyes shining in the soft lamplight. "You protected me when no one else would. You stood your ground. You fought for our family even when it nearly broke you. You saved us." The words hit deeper than he expected. He wasn't used to being praised, not like this, not for something that had cost him so much. But hearing them from her, it loosened something tight inside his chest. His throat tightened. "I did what I had to." "I know," she whispered, "and that's why I love you." They stayed on the deck until the sky went dark, sitting in the gentle quiet of a life beginning to settle back into itself. Later, as they prepared for bed, Frank's phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was a text from Tyler. "Tyler, just wanted to say good night, and thank you again. I'm grateful for you both, every day." Frank stared at the message for a long moment, simple, sincere, steady. Then, for the first time in months, he allowed himself to inhale deeply and exhale without fear. The weight was lifting. Peace, real peace, was beginning. Thanksgiving morning arrived with a soft gray sky and the faint scent of pine drifting through the neighborhood. Frank woke early, expecting the usual routine: coffee brewing, Maggie humming in the kitchen, maybe a quiet drive to the cabin if they decided to skip the holiday bustle. But when he came downstairs, something stopped him in place. Tyler was already in the kitchen. Not sitting, not brooding, not lost in thought. Cooking. The sight was almost strange. His son standing at the stove, sleeves rolled up, brow furrowed in concentration as he basted a turkey that looked far more ambitious than anything Frank had attempted in years. Pots simmered, vegetables were chopped with surprising precision, and the counter was covered in spices and recipe cards Maggie hadn't pulled out since Tyler was a teenager. Tyler turned when he heard footsteps. "Morning, Dad," he said, offering a tentative smile. "I thought maybe I'd cook this year." Frank blinked, taken off guard. "You don't have to do all this." "I know," Tyler said, his smile softening. "That's why I wanted to." Before Frank could respond, Maggie came in from the pantry carrying a tray of rolls. When she saw Tyler at the stove, her face lit up so brightly it seemed to warm the room. "Oh, sweetheart," she breathed, "look at you. I can't remember the last time you cooked for us." Tyler laughed under his breath. "I can't either. I think I was 13 and I burned the mashed potatoes." "You boiled them dry," Maggie said, giggling. "We had to open the windows for an hour." Even Frank smiled at that memory. He moved to the kitchen island and watched Tyler move confidently around the kitchen, checking timers, adjusting heat, tasting broth, doing all the things a man did when he cared deeply about the moment he was building. As the hours passed, the kitchen filled with the nostalgic warmth of Thanksgiving, the scent of sage, butter, roasted turkey, and Maggie's laughter. Frank didn't help much. He didn't have to. He just observed, quietly, thoughtfully, taking in the sight of his son, older now, humbled, softened by everything he'd endured. There was a wisdom in Tyler's eyes that hadn't been there before, a steadiness, a quiet determination that felt earned, not inherited. When dinner was finally ready, they sat at the table together, just the three of them. The plates were full, the candles flickered, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the house felt whole. They ate slowly, savoring each bite but savoring the silence even more. A peaceful silence, not tense, not waiting for the next blow. A silence filled with comfort, with healing. Then, as Maggie told a story from Tyler's childhood about the year he tried to convince the entire neighborhood Santa Claus was living in their shed, Tyler burst into laughter so genuine it startled even him. Frank watched that laugh carefully, the way it softened Tyler's features, the way it pushed aside months of exhaustion, the way it made him look, briefly, like the boy he used to be. They shared stories, passing them back and forth like small gifts, memories of camping trips, family dinners, childhood mishaps. Stories that had once bound them and were now stitching them together again. At one point, Tyler set down his fork and looked at Frank across the table, eyes shining with something deeper than gratitude. "Dad," he said quietly, "I don't think I ever thanked you, not properly, for not giving up on me, for standing by me even when I didn't deserve it." Frank held the gaze for a long moment. "You're my son," he said finally. "That's what fathers do." Tyler nodded, and a single tear slipped down his cheek. Not the broken tears of the past months, but a release, a letting go. Frank reached across the table and placed a steady hand on Tyler's shoulder. Not firm, not hesitant, just certain. Tyler exhaled softly, a sound that carried the weight of everything they'd survived. Maggie watched the moment unfold, her smile warm and full, her eyes misty. She reached for Tyler's other hand, squeezing it gently. And just like that, the room settled. Not just into silence, but into something deeper. Peace. Real peace. The kind that wasn't fragile or borrowed, but earned, painfully, slowly, honestly. Later, as they cleared the dishes together, shoulder to shoulder, Frank felt something in his chest loosen fully for the first time in months. He wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. He wasn't bracing for another crisis. He was living, breathing, reclaiming his family. And as the last dish clinked into the drying rack, Frank looked at Tyler, older, wiser, present, and new. For the first time in a long time, the worst was truly behind them. The world was quiet at sunrise, quiet in a way Frank hadn't heard in months. He stepped out into the backyard with a mug of steaming coffee, holding it between his palms as the first thin streaks of gold broke across the Portland sky. Dew clung to the grass. The air felt crisp, almost cleansing, and for a moment he simply breathed it in. The house behind him was warm, sleeping safe. He let his eyes wander across the yard, the fence he'd built himself 30 years ago, the small patch of herbs Maggie loved tending, the old swing Tyler used as a boy. Everything looked almost untouched, like time had circled back and washed away the chaos that had swallowed their lives. But the stillness didn't erase the memory playing in his mind. He closed his eyes. The night Brianna hit Maggie came back in a flash, the sharp crack of the slap, the shock frozen on Maggie's face, the heat that surged through Frank like a burst of fire. It had felt like watching someone strike his heart with an open palm. That moment had been the fracture line, the rift that forced everything open. The lies, the manipulation, the fear, the slow unraveling of their son. And Frank had defended Maggie not because he wanted a fight, not because he wanted revenge, but because protecting his wife was instinct, older than his anger, stronger than his pain. Behind him, the sliding door opened with a soft whisper. Tyler stepped outside holding 2 mugs. "Mom says you forgot this," he said, lifting the second coffee with a faint smile. "She didn't want your hands getting cold." Frank accepted the cup, and Tyler moved beside him, both of them facing the horizon as if trying to sync their thoughts to the slow rise of the sun. For a moment, neither spoke. Frank noticed how Tyler stood now, shoulders no longer slumped with shame, gaze steady even when tired. He was healing, still fragile in places, still rebuilding but healing nonetheless. Tyler inhaled the morning air slowly. "You always come out here at sunrise." "Only when I need to think," Frank said. Tyler nodded. "Makes sense." They stood in another long, quiet stretch, the kind of silence that wasn't uncomfortable, the kind that meant both men were searching for the right words. Finally, Frank broke it. "I defended your mother," he said softly, "because I love you both." Tyler turned his head slightly, eyes widening just a little at the confession. Frank kept his gaze forward. "You don't protect the person you love by destroying yourself," Frank continued. "You protect them by standing up when it's hardest, even when that means standing against your own family." Tyler swallowed hard. "Dad, I know, and I'm sorry I didn't understand that before." Frank didn't speak. He let the silence carry the weight of everything left unsaid. Tyler's voice was shaky when he finally spoke. "I almost lost both of you." Frank looked at him. Tyler wasn't exaggerating. There had been moments, terrifying, painful moments, when the family had been seconds from breaking completely. "We're still here," Frank said quietly. "Because you didn't give up on me," Tyler replied, "even when I gave you every reason to." Frank let out a slow breath, one that carried the tension of months. "You found your way back." Tyler managed a small nod, his eyes glassy but steady. "Thanks to you and Mom." Frank didn't put an arm around him. He didn't need to. The closeness between them didn't need gestures to prove itself anymore. It lived in the space between breaths, in every repaired conversation, in every shared meal. The sun rose a little higher, warmth settling gently across the yard. Tyler took a sip of coffee and sighed. "Mom's making pancakes," he said, voice lighter now. "She said it's a celebration breakfast." Frank smiled. "Of what?" "Of us," Tyler answered softly. Frank looked at his son, the man he had raised, lost, and found again, and felt the weight in his chest loosen fully. They turned toward the house, walking slowly, side by side, the cold grass bending beneath their steps. As they neared the back door, Tyler paused. "Dad." Frank stopped too, waiting. Tyler's voice softened. "I'm going to spend the rest of my life proving I'm worth the second chance you gave me." Frank didn't respond with words. He didn't need to. He simply placed a firm, quiet hand on Tyler's shoulder, steady, grounding, certain. Then together, they stepped back inside. The warmth of the home wrapped around them, the smell of pancakes drifting through the air, Maggie humming softly in the kitchen. And as the door closed behind them, Frank thought the words that had carried him through the darkest months, the truth he finally understood fully. Family isn't who doesn't break you, it's who stands strong after the breaking.